So in our last video, we talked about the CSF and how it breaks down into numbers. So basically, to shorten that, there's really 149 controls spread out over the 14 categories. Keep in mind that only 66 of those controls are required when you're pursuing certification. So what we're going to talk about in today's video really teaches you how to navigate the controls themselves. The CSF, when you download it from the HITRUST Alliance website, is a very lengthy document. There's a lot of content in there. So I really wanted to break it down for you and show you kind of step by step the makeup of the control, how to determine what your risk factors are, which levels apply to you, etc. So that's really what today's video is all about. So hopefully you'll stick with us for our next video, but really wanting to zero in on the controls themselves today. Okay, so before you open up that CSF document or before you begin any work in the My CSF tool, say for example you're going through a self-assessment, you really need to define your scope, because the scope is really where it all starts. You can possibly limit the scope to condense the amount of work that needs to be going into the assessment. Possibly if you have multiple business units, multiple geographic locations, really getting an understanding of what business units are going to be involved in that scope and how to really narrow that scope when it seems appropriate. A lot of smaller organizations, the entire organization may be what's in scope, but it's really important to start there. So if you have a flat network, everything's going to be in scope because there's no segmentation. So the proper way to segment, if you're going to take the business or the geographical region approach, you really need to make sure that you're scoped from a network perspective too, that you have proper segmentation in place. So keep that in mind. Always get a clear definition of scope, because if there are various business units involved, you'll want to make sure that the leaders from those business units and the appropriate people are brought into the assessment. That's one of the very first things that as an assessor firm, we're going to want to confirm is the scope of your environment. We're going to want to know the people involved. We're going to want to know the systems that are involved in that scope, because that is really what the assessment is going to be performed on. So like I said, whether you're starting in the My CSF tool or whether you're starting by just opening up the document to determine what you're compliant with and what you're not, really having an understanding of scope is really step one. So once you have that defined, what systems are in scope and what potential business units are in scope, then you can kind of move into determining what your risk factors are. We're talking about inherent risk factors associated with organizational, system, and regulatory items. All right, the very next thing that you're going to want to do after you determine what the scope of your environment is you're going to want to make a pretty simple assessment. There are different categories that you must select, whether again in the My CSF tool, or you have to have an understanding of that if you're just using the CSF to determine compliance. So for example, are you a health information exchange company? Are you a hospital? Of course, you know the answers to these questions, but payers, pharmacies, physician practices, service provider, IT, and non-IT, those are the two most common that we see for business associates. So understanding if you are categorized as a service provider IT or a service provider non-IT is definitely something to determine. So for example, a service provider, an IT service provider, is generally someone that provides IT services such as cloud hosting or cloud services or hosted IT infrastructure. So if you fit into that category, you're definitely a service provider IT. Service provider non-IT are companies that are generally defined as business associates that provide non-IT related services such as transcription services and clearinghouses. So you want to know, for example, what category you fit into, and based on that category, there are some risk factors that you'll want to know the answers to. So gathering this information before you begin the assessment is critical, because it's going to determine when, for example, level 2 or level 3 apply to your organization. So as you're going through the controls, you're going to want to know the answers. For example, if you are a service provider IT, what is the total record count that you have? If you don't know the answer to that, there's alternatives. You can know the annual record count, the total volume of data that you have in the systems that are, again, in scope. So people often ask me, what is considered a record? And of course, I just mentioned you have to know the answer to how many records you're maintaining in order to know which levels apply to you. So a record, as defined by HITRUST, is an instance where data items, fields, are stored with a unique identifier. Such records include but are not limited to the designated record as defined under HIPAA. So having an understanding of how many records you have, Obviously that's going to be what's included in the scope of your assessment. So gathering this data on the in-scope systems prior to starting the assessment is critical because you need to know where and when those level 2 and level 3 will apply. Also, for those in-scope systems, you're going to want to gather the following information. And again, you don't have to memorize or write down what I'm saying. It's all listed in the CSF, but I really want to walk through it just so I can explain it to you. So, for example, the in-scope systems, you have to know if they are storing, processing, or transmitting sensitive information. Is it accessible from the internet? Is it accessible by a third party? Is it publicly accessible? Is there mobile technology being used on the in-scope systems? What is the total number of users? So again, the important thing is not that I'm giving you the entire list here today. The important thing is remembering that you must gather this information prior to jumping in and starting to assess yourself against the controls. So again, step number 1 is defining the scope. Is it a different business unit? Is it a geographic location? Is it a segmentation? Is it systems that are segmented on the network? For example, those are the types of things you want to know before you start the assessment. And then recognizing your organizational factors. How many records do you have, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, evaluating the in-scope systems. So the CSF also has a number of regulatory considerations, so regulatory inherent risk factors that would apply. So if, for example, PCI applies to your environment, FSMA, maybe the FTC red flags rule or the HITECH Act, there's a list of regulatory factors that may or may not affect the in-scope systems, your scope as you've defined it. So understanding that before you get started will also determine which levels apply to you. Now, for example, when you use the MyCSF tool, if you're going through a self-assessment using the MyCSF tool, these are all questions that you have to answer before the questionnaire is built. So you have to know the answers to these questions. And most likely, if you're working with an assessment firm, these are all the questions they're going to ask you right off the bat before working with you. Because the answers to these questions will determine how many requirement statements actually will apply. So it really determines, like I said, scalability. Is it going to be a rather small assessment or is it going to be a rather large assessment? So the answers to these questions from an organizational, a regulatory, and a system aspect will determine the number of controls that apply and how long or short the assessment is going to be overall. So now I'm actually going to break it down. I want you to follow along if you have the CSF in front of you, if you've downloaded it, if you've got version 8.1, which is the current version as of the recording of this video. I want to take you to page 280 if you want to follow along. If not, you can just kind of listen to the way I'm describing this. But each control is broken down, and the control reference example I'm going to share with you today is the physical entry control. So for this example, the control specification, and I apologize for reading, but I don't have these memorized. Secure areas shall be protected by appropriate entry control to ensure that only authorized personnel are allowed access. So the other thing that you'll notice on this particular control is that there's an asterisk that says required for HITRUST certification, CSF version 8.1. So every control that is required for certification, again, it's one of those 66 controls, is defined within the CSF as required for certification. So if it's not listed there, you know that this is not a control that would apply if you're working towards a certification as the end result. So in this particular control, we read the control specification. We know that it affects its factor type organizational, which means the organizational risk factors that we talked about a minute ago will really come into play. So in my example today, we're looking at level 1 implementation requirements for this particular control. Now let's pretend, for example, we are a IT provider. So we are a service provider, IT. That's in my example. So what's going to really apply in this particular control is how many records do we have that we talked about earlier. So I'm looking at level 1 implementation requirements. I'm going down through the list, and I know that all of these controls are going to apply to me because this is going to apply to everyone. So I'm going to look down and I'm going to say, okay, I have to have visitor logs. I have to make sure that my visitor records contain the following information. Name and organization, signature, form of identification, et cetera, et cetera. You can read all that, obviously, in the CSF. But what I really wanted to walk you through is what's next. So, for example, level 2 would apply to me as an IT service provider if I had between 15 and 60 terabytes of total data. So if my data falls within that category, I need to make sure that all of level 1 implementation requirements are met, as well as level 2. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that my visitor log shall also contain the date and time of entry and departure, the visitor's name, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit of a deeper, the concept here is that the greater the risk, the more controls that are in place to protect that risk. So having between 15 and 60 terabytes of data increases my overall risk as a business partner to my client. So going on down through the list, if you're looking at, again, IT service provider, if I have more than 60 terabytes of data that I'm maintaining for my client, then you have to also consider that doors to internal secure areas are locked, implementing a door delay alarm, and be equipped with electronic lock. So that's an example of, I have to have now all of level 1, all of level 2, and all of level 3 in place. That is only if, as an IT provider, I am housing more than 60 terabytes of data. So again, that ties back to understanding those risk factors involved with your scope before you go into the assessment, because you're going to need to know how deep do you need to go. All right, so this gives you a basic idea of how the controls are structured. So understanding what your risk factors are, and first and foremost determining if that control, if level 1, 2, or 3 applies to you. The other things I really didn't cover here are, have to do with the regulatory risk factor. So if you're navigating the CSF and you also see, and PCI, for example, applies to you, you would also have to make sure that those requirement statements that are in the PCI section also are implemented. So it really kind of builds upon, it builds layers as you go. Like I said, the CSF is scalable. So starting at level 1, really applying to all organizations, adding on level 2, level 3, and then those regulatory requirements when they apply really just adds more of a layered approach. So really it's relevant to how much risk you are really trying to maintain. So again, it's a risk-based framework that works very nicely in the layers that I described. So that really concludes this video, really wanting to just define for you how the controls are structured and how to know what applies to you and what doesn't. And coming on into our next video, we're going to talk about your different assessment options. So we're going to talk about the SOC 2 options, the validated assessment, the certification, all of that information that will help you determine the next step, which is what is your goal in achieving an assessment. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And again, if you need any help immediately, please contact us directly with the link below.